What if the world goes to war with Russia over Ukraine? To understand this question and the weight that it holds, we need to first understand what the heck is going on with Russia and what the heck is going on with Ukraine. This in itself is a complex question and requires a little bit of a history lesson to answer. Ukraine has only been an independent nation for just over 30 years, starting in 1991. This, however, doesn't mean that it doesn't have a deep and rich history to it, because it certainly does. The reason it hasn't been an independent country for longer is because it's consistently been under fire from other nations. Whether it be the Austro-Hungarian forces, Poland, or the biggest aggressor on Ukraine, Russia, it feels as if Ukraine has always been an area of interest to other countries looking to expand their territory. In 1991, it finally gained its independence, though, due to the fall of the Soviet Union. This was a long and tough road for the Ukrainian people. Over the past century, they had dealt with many occupations, a full-on horrible genocide that transpired in the 30s by Joseph Stalin, which frankly doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and many other horrific and trying times. Needless to say, the Ukrainian people were very happy to get said independence when 90% of them voted to make it so in 1991. The Russian people weren't as happy with all this, though. Since Ukraine had been on and off under Russian control for so long, there are some very deep ties with Russia. Ukrainian culture is very similar to Russian culture, and a lot of the people that live in Ukraine were originally of Russian descent. This is part of the reason why Vladimir Putin and the Russian government doesn't even look at Ukraine as an independent nation, but simply as an extension of Russia. That's why Russia has always been trying to interfere with Ukraine's attempts at joining international organizations to stop their claim at being an independent country. We also need to touch on what took place in 2014 when the Russian government annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula was always an area of deep interest to Russia because of what happened in 1954. In that year, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic transferred the Crimean Peninsula over to the Ukrainian SSR. When Ukraine got its independence, they retained this state until Russia annexed it in 2014. Russia has always felt like it belonged to them, largely because most of the population of the state were originally Russian and therefore decided to take it back a few years ago. This was in violation of many treaties that the Russian government had previously signed, though, and obviously didn't make the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian people very happy. Since that point, tensions between the two nations have continued to escalate, and now there have been serious rumblings about a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is because Russia has just so happened to move roughly 100,000 of their troops to the border of Ukraine in what seems to be the preliminary stages of an invasion. Other world leaders have accused Russia of planning to invade Ukraine, with Biden coming out and saying he will move in. Russia, however, has denied these allegations and basically said that they're allowed to move their troops around in their own country to their heart's desire. This isn't wrong, but it doesn't take a genius to see that something is a little fishy here. With all of this being said, if Russia does decide to invade Ukraine, what's gonna happen? Is this the conflict that will start World War III? Time to look at what it means if the world goes to war with Russia over Ukraine. Okay, so before we all hit the panic button, I do want to say that most experts and analysts don't think that Russia's going to invade Ukraine yet. The reason they think this is just simply because the juice may not be worth the squeeze in this scenario. If Russia was to attack Ukraine, then some of the other world leaders have made it very clear there would be measures taken to stop said invasion. NATO would get involved, and this conflict could erupt into something very bad and deadly very quickly. Basically, it wouldn't be quite as easy as how it was in 2014, and Russia would certainly suffer some serious losses. It should also be noted that sanctions are already in place with Russia and some key countries, and those would obviously get far more restrictive if a war was to take place. However, even though there are sanctions with some countries to the west, it's thought that Russia believes they can weather this storm by increasing trade with countries to the east, such as China. This is theoretically possible, but an invasion of Ukraine would definitely cause a storm of problems Russia may not be willing to take on right now. Now, even though this is what some experts are thinking, we need to factor in what some of the other world leaders are coming out and saying publicly. Biden has come out and said he believes Russia will be invading Ukraine very soon. Boris Johnson has come out and warned about such an invasion, saying that it would be painful painful, violent, and bloody business, whilst also making it very clear the UK would commit troops to NATO if an invasion did occur. So even though analysts still think some well-enforced sanctions and diplomacy can work all of this out, there is a real threat here, and we should all be starting to pay attention around the world. Now, let's assume it happens. Let's assume that Russia invades Ukraine. What happens next? Well, first off, Ukraine is gonna need some help. BBC released a great image comparing the military strength of Russia and Ukraine, and it's more than clear who has the advantage here. 4.5 times the number of active soldiers, roughly 15 times more attack aircraft, way more tanks, way more vehicles, pretty much way more everything. So if Russia was to invade Ukraine and Ukraine got no help at all, then one would have to believe eventually Russia would emerge victorious and take over the country. However, if we believe what we're currently hearing from other world leaders, then Ukraine wouldn't be by themselves. They would have the assistance of NATO. The Week published a great article on January 25th posing the question of who would win in a fight between NATO and Russia. In that article, they write, research published in 2019 by the Royal United Services Institute found that British forces would be comprehensively outgunned in any conflict with Russia in Eastern Europe. The RUSI found that the British Army and its NATO allies have a critical shortage of artillery and ammunition, meaning they would struggle to maintain a credible defense position if Russia were to opt for all-out aggression. At present, there is a risk that the UK, unable to credibly fight, can be dominated lower down the escalation ladder by powers threatening escalation, said RUSI's report. But the UK wouldn't need to stand alone against Russia, and NATO's biggest player, the US, has an overwhelming advantage over Russia in conventional forces, Russian military analyst Alexander Goltz told Deutsche Welle. While Felgenhauer agreed with Goltz's assessment of the US's military advantage, he warned that open warfare often comes down to far more than the inventories that each side of the conflict can call upon. He told DW that it's like predicting the result of a soccer match, adding, yes, basically, Brazil should beat America in soccer, but I've seen Americans beat Brazil in South Africa at the Confederations Cup. You never know the result until the game is played. So basically, it's thought that if there was to be a full-on aggression from Russia that escalated to a point where all of NATO was committed and all of Russia was committed, then NATO should come out on top, but upsets happen all the time and nothing is a guarantee. This is part of the reason why experts think Russia will hold off before invading, because you never really want to start a war if you're the underdogs unless you have to. But back to the question at hand. What if this happened? Well, if you live in North America, one would think that you should be fine, at least for the time being. However, there is one massive factor that we haven't even considered in any of this so far: China. How will one of the world's superpowers respond if Russia and NATO are engaging in a full-on war in Europe? Even though China probably doesn't care about many of the core issues between the Russians and Ukrainians, this war would definitely end up affecting them. Western sanctions on Russia would find a way to affect China and most likely force their hand to pick sides. This becomes a massive variable in all of this, because I don't think anyone has any idea how involved China would get in a conflict like this if it did happen. It's clear that China's relationship with Russia is stronger than it is with the US, but is it so strong that they're willing to fully go into war? No one really knows until it actually happens. That's why, sadly, the answer to this question is almost impossible to know for sure. Pretty much all we can say is what the world leaders are telling us right now. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said, "We've been very clear that if there is any further Russian aggression in terms of sending Russian forces into Ukraine, there will be a swift, severe, and united response from the United States and Europe. And therefore, that's what's going to happen." What happens after this step is honestly anyone's guess. I would hope that NATO would be able to stop Russia from invading the country, but anything can happen, and with the amount of other variables on the table, such as other countries whose intentions are currently unknown, it's really hard to say how this war would develop. Although I can say almost almost certainly that gas prices would probably go up a lot, so that's something we can all look forward to if the world goes to war with Russia over Ukraine. But please let me know in the comments down below, what do you think about all this stuff that's going on right now? Is Russia actually going to invade, or is it all just a bunch of smoke? Also, if you happen to live in Ukraine or around that area of the world, please comment down below your thoughts on this whole situation right now and how you're feeling about it. I'd love to hear firsthand. Also, hit the like and subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching. I've been your host, Nicholas Playlog, and I'll catch you next time. What if Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow? If you've been checking the news recently, then you've probably heard that Russia and Ukraine aren't in the best of relations right now. The two countries have had their differences for decades, and it seems as if Russia has finally had enough. To understand what would happen if Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow, it's important to do a little history lesson on why Russia is considering attacking Ukraine in the first place. Most wars these days are fought over one very powerful and important resource: money. Typically, almost every conflict we see can be boiled down to human greed and the desire for more money and influence. Although this is certainly a factor here, I wouldn't say that's the main reason why Russia is interested in attacking Ukraine. The main factor here is history. You see, Russia and Ukraine, even though they're feuding right now, were once very close. So close, in fact, that they were basically one and the same. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and was governed by Russia. This is why, if you trace the lineage of many of the Ukrainian people, you'll find that a few generations ago they were actually from Russia. Because of this, Ukrainian culture is very similar to Russian culture. Their capital city, Kiev, is said to basically be a whole nother Moscow or St. Petersburg. This isn't to say that Ukraine doesn't have their own rich and historic culture, because they certainly do. The thing with Ukraine, though, is that they've pretty much always been fighting for their independence. If you look back at Ukrainian history, there's really no extended periods of time where this country is not under attack or under rule by another country. They just happen to be smack dab right in the middle of Europe in a highly contested area from a lot of strong neighboring countries. During the last century, they've suffered from several occupations, a full-on genocide from Joseph Stalin, and tons of other atrocities that should really get discussed on the world stage a lot more. This adds to the fuel of the Ukrainian people and their deep and very warranted desire to be their own independent country. If we take a trip back to 1991, we saw this on full display when Ukraine had a vote for their independence. In that vote, 92.3% of people in Ukraine voted to be independent. Think about that. 92.3%. It's hard to get 92.3% of people to do anything, let alone vote on something as in a country's independence. Either way, Ukraine has been independent for just over 30 years, and from all accounts, they want to keep it that way. Russia, however, has made their intentions of taking over very clear. Actions speak louder than words, and their actions in 2014 when they annexed the Crimean Peninsula showed the world exactly where their heads are at. The world let them get away with that, but it doesn't seem as if the rest of the world leaders are going to sit back and allow them to take over any more of Ukraine once again. So, with all that being said, what if Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow? Okay, well, first off, I want to pump the brakes a little bit and say that I don't believe that Russia will be invading tomorrow, but it could be happening very soon. Joe Biden also doesn't think it could be happening tomorrow, but he's under the impression that things could go down in February. BBC writes about the potential of invasion by saying, US President Joe Biden has warned there is a distinct possibility Russia might invade Ukraine next month, the White House says. Russia, meanwhile, says it sees a little ground for optimism in resolving the crisis after the US rejected Russia's main demands. The buildup of tens of thousands of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders in recent weeks has stoked fears of an invasion. Russia denies it is planning an attack. The US president made the comments in a telephone conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday. President Biden said that there is a distinct possibility that the Russians could invade Ukraine in February, White House National Security Council spokesperson Emily Horne said. He has said this publicly, and we have been warning about this for months. During their talk, President Biden reaffirmed the readiness of the United States along with its allies and partners to respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine, a White House statement said. Mr. Zelensky said they discussed recent diplomatic efforts on de-escalation and agreed on joint actions for the future. So that's what the BBC wrote, and even though we can take solace in the fact that things may not be going down tomorrow, we also need to start worrying that these threats could be be very real. If they attacked literally tomorrow though, then what are the immediate actions that would follow? Well, NBC News writes, with more than 100,000 Russian troops deployed on Ukraine's border, President Vladimir Putin is keeping the West guessing, will he opt for a full-scale invasion or a more limited operation, or simply keep Russian forces in place to maintain pressure on Kiev and the West. Enjoying an overwhelming military advantage over Ukraine's smaller, less advanced forces, Russia has a variety of options if Putin decides to launch an attack, depending on what Moscow wants to achieve, the price it is willing to pay, and how the West responds, experts say. With Russia's formidable air and naval power, any offensive would most likely feature bombing raids, missile strikes, and cyber attacks that could devastate Ukraine's military infrastructure, disrupt communications, and pin down ground troops. There's an incredibly large force that's on the border, much larger than the one that invaded and annexed Ukrainians' Crimean Peninsula in 2014, said Philip Breedlove, a retired 4-star US Air Force general who was NATO's supreme commander from 2013 to 2016. You have a Ukrainian land army that's gotten much better, much more capable since 2014, said Breedlove, who is now at the Middle East Institute, a Washington-based think tank, but the Russians would own the air and the sea. So if Russia attacked tomorrow, we would most likely see how this war is going to shape out. Are they trying to do small targeted attacks, or is this a full-on invasion with tanks and planes rolling in? Their type of attack would dictate the response from the Ukrainian people and the world. One thing is for sure though, Joe Biden came out and said it himself, and that is that NATO would have Ukraine's back. NATO is comprised of a bunch of powerful nations that are united in supporting Ukraine here. Russia knows that if they were to launch an attack on Ukraine, that NATO's response would be swift and unforgiving. In the last video we did about this, we looked at who would win between these two superpowers, and we concluded that NATO would definitely have the advantage, but it's not such an overwhelming advantage that Russia couldn't pull something out. If NATO does get involved like they say they will, then things could get very bad very quickly. Sanctions are already being heavily applied to Russia, and that's only going to get worse if we enter a full-on war with them. Also, if it is NATO versus Russia, this has real potential to get other superpowers involved. It seems silly to think that China is going to sit back and chill just watching the chaos unfold. One has to believe that they would get involved in the fray in some capacity as well, although it's hard to determine exactly how or what they would do. If Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow, then I would also think travel is going to get restricted pretty fast. I'm not exactly sure how this would all go down, but depending on the severity of the conflict, I could see it being impossible to travel to Russia in the near future. It's also been said by the Western allies that they want to target Russia's economy if they were to invade. So it seems like the beginning plan would be to send in enough troops to stop Russia from progressing and then apply major sanctions and other things to create a chokehold over the country's economy. This could potentially be successful, but it's also been said that Russia may then just turn to China as a trade partner and go there instead. This is all speculative and very far down the line, so there are a lot of variables involved in whether this is going to happen or not. Here's the stuff that we know for sure. Russia has tens of thousands of troops stationed very close to the borders of Ukraine. These troops were moved here for a specific reason, one that Putin and Russia refused to tell the rest of the world. If Russia was to invade Ukraine and Ukraine received no help at all, Ukraine would most likely lose to Russia. However, if Russia was to invade Ukraine, then Ukraine wouldn't be by themselves and NATO would come to their rescue very quickly. After this, though, is when things get hazy. What other countries get involved is unknown, and how far Russia wants to push this invasion is unknown as well. Ukraine still hopes they can resolve this with diplomacy, but at the end of the day, if Russia wants to own the country, then there really isn't any amount of diplomacy that can occur to stop them from trying to take it. Hopefully all of this is just a bunch of smoke and it doesn't actually happen, because if it does, who knows how bad this scenario could get. But guys, please let me know in the comments down below what you think about this whole scenario and what you think is gonna happen if Russia invades Ukraine tomorrow. I would love to hear your opinion on this as well. Also, please hit the like and subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching. I've been your host, Nicholas Playlog, and I'll catch you next time.
What if America invaded Russia right now? At the time of writing for this video, the whole world is watching Eastern Europe incredibly carefully as over 100,000 Russian troops have been amassed alongside the eastern border of Ukraine, causing a tidal wave of debate across the globe as to whether Vladimir Putin is actually planning to invade Ukraine or whether this is merely more saber-rattling as Russia attempts to gain concessions from NATO and other Western nations. While many NATO-allied nations have begun making preparations to invoke sanctions against Russia if they continue their aggression, many are waiting to see exactly how committed Putin is to his potential invasion plan. And although American President Joe Biden has claimed that no American troops will be sent into Ukraine in a combat role, is there a possibility that America could invade Russia before Russia can harm Ukraine? The answer is a bit more complicated than you might think. The United States and Russia, formerly known as the Soviet Union, have a long and complicated history as the two biggest superpowers on the global stage following the end of the Second World War. For decades, the two were locked in a Cold War based around their competing ideologies and the growing threat of both sides having a sizable nuclear stockpile. This was the whole reasoning behind the coldness of the Cold War in the first place. Neither side wanted to be the first to use nuclear arms against the other because it would likely lead to mutually assured destruction, as both sides would be forced to unleash their salvos of stored nuclear weapons. And while the threat of mutually assured destruction has become much lower since the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia's resurgence as a singular country again, the United States and Russia are still opposed to one another after so many decades of being tense enemies. If America were to suddenly attempt to invade Russia itself, they'd be breaking almost a century's worth of precedent and begin a war that would be the farthest thing from cold, even if nuclear weapons likely wouldn't be invoked. The first issue with the United States of America attempting to invade the Russian mainland is a matter of distance. There's over 7,100 kilometers, or 4,400 miles, between the continental US and the border of Russia, with the Atlantic Ocean and the rest of Europe making up the bulk of that incredibly long distance. Ironically, if America decided to invade from the opposite direction over the Pacific Ocean, they'd have a slightly shorter distance of 6,600 kilometers, or 4,100 miles, but given that the entirety of that distance would be over the ocean, it would be extremely impractical to launch any attacks over such a distance. If the United States wanted to get any actual boots on the ground in Russia, they would likely be forced to rely heavily on allied military bases throughout Europe and Asia, with tens of thousands of troops already stationed in South Korea and the Persian Gulf countries that could be used to quickly launch an attack on Russia. However, any country that allowed US troops to launch directly from their soil would also risk angering Russia further, and might get pulled into the conflict more heavily than our allies would like. Attacking Russia during the wintertime is notoriously difficult even under ideal circumstances, and having to negotiate a starting base of operations and which countries would be willing to fully engage in war with Russia would be a huge diplomatic hurdle that the United States would have to find a way to deal with. And any countries in the region that aren't necessarily the most friendly with the United States might take issue with the US suddenly rolling thousands of troops and equipment through on their way to Russia, thus causing even more problems than the United States would have to contend with. Now, the main expectation if any actual fighting breaks out in Eastern Europe is that it would mostly center on Ukraine itself, given that Russia's been amassing troops and technology on their border for several months now. However, the United States invading Russia directly would be tremendously unexpected, given how difficult a direct attack on Russia would be, but it might have some advantages to simply fighting within Ukraine. If the United States were able to attack key Russian infrastructure before Russia was fully aware they were being invaded, the United States might be able to take advantage of the fact that many of Russia's troops are currently focused on preparing for their own invasion of Ukraine. The United States likely would need to supply some troops directly to Ukraine to make sure that Russia didn't make their own aggressive move in the area, but their main focus would be getting as many special forces and tactical units into Russia as undetected as possible. However, in a world of 5G internet and satellite surveillance, getting armed troops into a country without being detected is far easier said than done. Furthermore, while Russia's defenses wouldn't be at their peak due to 100,000 troops being actively involved in preparing for invasion on Ukraine's borders, this still leaves 750,000 active members in the Russian military that could be called upon to fall back and defend the country if an American attack were to suddenly take place or an American invasion attempted. The United States would need to commit an absolutely massive amount of troops, equipment, and technology technology if it wanted to have any hope of securing a foothold on even the very edge of Russian territory, which would be made all the more difficult by the fact that much of this equipment would need to be airlifted, utilizing the entirety of the US Air Force's transportation forces simply to get anything noteworthy on the ground. Combine this with the active threat that would be posed to any American aircraft by Russian defenses and rockets, and you have a situation that could snowball into disaster and stranded American troops incredibly quickly. The United States might currently have 1.3 million active personnel in their military, but that large number would mean nothing when it comes to an invasion if they couldn't safely get those troops within firing distance of Russia. Combined with anti-war and support the troops sentiments conflicting at home, and the United States might have a lot more to lose from an outright invasion of Russia than it would ever have to gain. At the end of the day, the situation going on in Eastern Europe with Russia and Ukraine is a very serious one, and it's a situation that we can only hope won't result in bloodshed or the loss of further land for the Ukraine people. While a full-out invasion of Russia committed by the United States is an extremely unlikely possibility given the current tactics being used by NATO members and Joe Biden's commitment to not using American troops for combat during this standoff, it's still an interesting possibility to think and talk about and wonder just how such a radical plan would play out. So if you enjoyed this video and the topic of discussion, be sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and let us know down in the comments what sorts of videos you'd like to see next. As always, this has been Life's Biggest Questions, and we'll see you all next time.
Is World War III happening right now? Over the past month, the news stories have been ramping up. The media has been foaming at the mouth, speculating on how the next Great War could start any day now. This is because of the growing tension along the Ukrainian and Russian border. We've already talked a decent amount about this conflict on this channel, but once again, we do need to have a little history lesson to understand why this tension is even here at all. In case you weren't familiar, Russia doesn't like Ukraine. Or maybe they actually like them a little bit too much. Either way, they aren't a fan of how Ukraine is currently their own independent nation and believe that they should be a part of Russia. This is all because of what went down in the last century. Over the last 100 years, Ukraine has been under occupation or attack for most of it. Lots of the time was spent under the rule of the Soviet Union. This is because after World War II, Ukraine merged into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and became part of the Soviet Union. This was the status quo until 1991 when the Soviet Union fell and Ukraine voted for their independence. In that vote, a staggering 92.3% of the country wanted to become independent from Russia, and finally they were. The fact that 92.3% of the country wanted to get away should tell you how the Ukrainian people felt about being under Russian rule. In short, not great. There's also a horrible history here because Ukraine acted as Joseph Stalin's punching bag for quite some time. In the 1930s, he starved the Ukrainian people and millions died. It was said by survivors of this famine that Russian soldiers would see the Ukrainian people making a stew of twigs and leaves and literally force them to dump it out. So needless to say, it was really bad. All of this history has caused there to be some really bad blood between both countries over the years. There's also the whole situation that happened rather recently with the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula was a region of Ukraine that got annexed by the Russians in 2014. This region of Ukraine had a large Russian population due to what took place in 1954. In 1954, the Crimean Peninsula was actually part of Russia until it was given over to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Then, when Ukraine got independence, it retained this land even though Russia wanted it back. Finally, their frustration boiled over when they eventually decided to just walk in and take it. This caused an uproar on the world stage, but Russia really didn't care less and continued along their merry way, annexing the entire region. Now, tensions are flaring once again, and over the last 6 months, Russian troops have been slowly moving their way to the border of Ukraine. This has led to many world leaders calling the Russians out and accusing them of planning an invasion. Russia has flat out denied such claims saying that they can do as they please with their troops in their own nation. Something is definitely up though, and with the powers that are at play, this certainly has the makings of the beginning of a major world war. Now, to answer the question of the video, is World War III happening right now? No. No, World War III is not currently happening. However, that doesn't mean that it isn't gonna happen very soon. The Insider has come out with a great article talking about the places in the world where World War III is most likely to break out. In that article, they write, "Easily the most likely flashpoint for great power war in 2022 lies along the border between Russia and Ukraine. Over the past 6 months, Russia has steadily built up forces along the frontier as Kiev, Moscow, and Washington have traded barbs. Russia's immediate concerns involve the Ukrainian acquisition and use of Turkish drones along its border regions, along with a general increase in Ukrainian military power. Moscow's long-range problem is its inability to reverse the Western orientation that Kiev has adopted since 2014. Russia has publicly argued that it wants to resolve the issues of Ukraine and of Russia's relationship with NATO on a permanent basis. The United States and NATO have not responded positively to these overtures, but have notably failed to guarantee Ukrainian security. If Russia launches an invasion of Ukraine, things could get ugly quickly. Despite improvements in Ukrainian forces, most analysts expect that Russia would win quick victories along the border, potentially gaining access to the Ukrainian heartland. Direct Russian military action would put immense pressure on the United States to respond in some fashion. And respond they would. Joe Biden has come out and said publicly that they would have Ukraine's back if Russia was to invade. This would come in the form of sanctions and most likely the mobilization of troops to Ukraine. NATO would also be right there as well and sending tons of allies to Ukraine's aid. If the United States, NATO, and Russia are all involved in a war, then one can certainly make the argument that we have reached the criteria for World War III. Also, you have to imagine that if all of these powers get into it with one another, that other countries are going to want to join the fray as well. China is currently sitting back and watching as this unfolds. Many experts on the subject are struggling to determine exactly how China would respond if something like this were to break out. However, they are all in agreement that they wouldn't sit back and do nothing forever. There are also a ton of other smaller countries that would likely find their way into the mix if something like this occurred, and before we know it, the world would be at war. So if we aren't at war now, then when could we be, and what can we do to stop this from happening? Well, we stop it from happening with diplomacy. The two sides need to talk and work something out. Problem is, they have a hard time being in the same room as each other and don't really like to converse. Bigger problem is that the things Russia wants are things that the other side is not willing to give them. One of the big sticking points right now is for Ukraine to never be allowed into NATO. Part of the reason Russia wants this is because it would further enforce Ukraine as an independent nation, which they don't like. It would also add lots of Western influence over Ukraine, something that Russia doesn't want for their next door neighbor. NATO has responded to these reports along with some other ones saying that these are impossible requests. If neither side is willing to budge, then we're gonna run into an issue here pretty fast. Now, I should note that the UN is going to be addressing some of these issues very soon, and there will be a public meeting on the matter. The problem is that Russia doesn't even want to be there. The UN voted on Monday about having a public meeting on Russia's growing force on Ukraine's border, and the vote passed 10-2. The two that voted against it, though, were Russia themselves and China. So clearly, Russia has no desire to publicly meet about what they're up to, and therefore, it's going to be really hard to come up with a diplomatic solution. If diplomacy doesn't win out and resolve the issue, and we do enter World War III, when could that happen? Well, honestly, any day now. Joe Biden has come out and warned the public that he believes something is gonna go down in February and that Russia will make a move then. Russia has obviously come out and denied such things, but we're talking about the United States president publicly warning us about an actual war with a superpower this month. If there's any substance to these claims, then that's really scary. Now, we could just be dealing with a big Russian ruse, and that's something that needs to be evaluated as well. Some experts are saying that this whole truth troop mobilization is just a ploy from Putin and he actually has no intention to invade whatsoever. Simply by placing 100,000 troops at the border forces the United States and others to focus on that and take their demands very seriously. This threat of war is very real, and even if he doesn't intend to pull the trigger, the global superpowers must acknowledge it. This could be very true, and if that's the case, then Putin is definitely out here playing a good chess game. The thing is, the rest of the world simply can't take that risk. They have to take this threat seriously and focus in on what's going on, because simply allowing Russia to walk in and capture Ukraine isn't an option anymore. Also, we haven't mentioned in this video, but it is believed that if Ukraine was to stand by themselves in such a battle, then even though they may put up a bit of a fight, Russia would come out victorious without incurring horrible losses. Ukraine needs the support of their allies if they are to retain their independence, assuming an invasion does in fact happen. All in all, we aren't in World War III yet, but give it a few weeks. I'm really hoping that this whole thing dies down and diplomacy wins out, but with the way things are going, it's hard to see how that's gonna happen. But please let me know in the comments down below your thoughts. What do you think is gonna happen here? If there is a World War III, then how is it gonna play out, and who would win that conflict if it did happen? Also, please hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I've been your host, Nicholas Playlog, and I'll catch you next time. Can Ukraine defend a Russian invasion by itself? As we've been talking about on this channel a lot recently, Russia and Ukraine are not on the friendliest of terms right now. I suppose specifying and saying they aren't on the friendliest of terms right now might be a bit misleading though, because frankly, these guys have never really been on the friendliest of terms. These two countries have a deep and dark history between them that spans many generations. Considering we've talked pretty extensively about this in other videos recently, I'm not going to go too deep into it, just the Cole's Notes version. Basically, Ukraine hasn't been their own country for very long, only a bit over 30 years in fact. This is because for the longest time they were part of the Soviet Union. After World War II, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was founded, and this was connected to the Soviet Union. Therefore, during this period of time, Ukraine was not an independent nation, but was under control. They didn't gain their solidarity until 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved and a vote was held to see if the Ukrainian people wanted their independence. They definitely did, because a staggering 92.3% of the population voted to separate from Russia and become their own nation. Russia was never happy about this separation and has made it clear over the years that they believe Ukraine is an extension of Russia. An extension of Russia that they very much want back. This is part of the reason why Russia's putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian border right now. Ukraine has been getting closer to the possibility of joining NATO, something that would solidify their claim as a country on the world stage and give them some very powerful allies. It would also add a strong Western influence to Ukraine, which is something Russia definitely doesn't want for their next door neighbor. Russia and the United States certainly aren't on the best of terms, so having a strong United States ally right by them isn't in their best interest. So this is why we're in the situation right now where Russia has roughly 100,000 soldiers just chilling on the Ukrainian border, looking as if they could attack any day. Now, obviously, no one should want an invasion because, as many analysts have predicted, this could easily devolve into a full-on European war. Also, even if it didn't, then there would still be a ton of casualties from the Ukrainians and the Russians. But if we were to look at the worst possible scenario and say that Russia did invade Ukraine, would they be able to defend themselves? Well, before I fully delve into this question, I do want to say that they most likely wouldn't have to. NATO, the powerful alliance that Ukraine wants to become a part of, has said that it will come to Ukraine's aid if Russia attacks. The United States and Britain have been two of the most vocal in regards to their feelings about this potential invasion. Both Joe Biden and Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson have come out and warned Russia about the consequences of such an invasion, talking about how deadly it's going to be. In fact, the United States have already started mobilizing troops and moving them over to Europe. The other day, they announced that they were moving 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe. Now, even though 3,000 troops might seem like a lot, it really isn't when you consider the massive scale to Russia's army. However, that being said, 3,000 is still better than zero, so in reality, Ukraine will never need to defend its borders solely by itself. But on the off chance chance the United States pull all their forces back and NATO changes their mind, how would Ukraine fare against Russia? Well, short answer, not great. In a previous LBQ, I pulled this picture up of the Russian army versus the Ukrainian army, and I think now would be a good time to do that again. BBC released this image comparing the two, and as you can see, one side is definitely doing better than the other one. The difference in troops isn't horrible, like Russia definitely has an advantage here, but it isn't so overwhelming that Ukraine doesn't have a shot. What really isn't ideal for Ukraine though is how far behind they are in equipment. Russia literally has 15 times the attack aircraft that Ukraine has. They have way more tanks, way more armored vehicles, and way more artillery. At the end of the day, having troops is great, but they won't do a whole lot against the thousands of tanks that are rolling in. They also can't be that effective if there are enemy aircraft flying over top of them, dropping whatever they feel like on them. And this is sadly the reality of the situation. Most experts believe that even though the Ukrainian army has a lot of heart and a lot of fight, they would inevitably lose out because Russia would just absolutely dominate the air. Also, Russia would most likely own the Black Sea as well and dominate Ukraine in any naval battles that may take place. All of this doesn't bode well for Ukraine if they were left to fight by themselves. This is also only looking at one specific area of warfare and doesn't account for the whole other side of things. Strategy. Having the numbers in your favor is always a massive advantage, but as we've seen throughout history, a well thought out defense strategy can turn the tides of any battle. So with that being said, is it possible that Ukraine could just outmaneuver the Russians with some brilliant strategy? Well, nothing is impossible, but it's highly unlikely. In an article dedicated to this question, Mike Eckel writes, "How long could Ukraine's armed forces hold out against a bigger, more powerful military force like Russia's? Russia will find them a determined, robust, and enduring army, whatever Putin chooses to do," said Glenn Grant, a retired British Army artillery officer who served as an advisor to the Ukrainian military. The big challenge as I see it is not the military but the political. There is little faith in the country that the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces and his administration are as prepared, thoughtful, and robust as the army and population at large. Much will depend upon what sort of attack Putin decides to follow. There is no appetite in the country for political surrender. So here's the big problem with what I just read there. The man who is being quoted is a retired army officer who worked as an advisor for Ukraine's military. He would have been there, in the room, seeing how they run their operation. If this man is already coming out and saying that he doesn't have faith in the leaders to be as prepared, thoughtful, or robust, then I personally have a very hard time seeing how they're going to out-strategize the Russians. It should also be noted that those 98 attack aircraft that the Ukrainians have and other equipment isn't in the best of conditions. Mike Eckel also writes, "Much weaponry and equipment remains outdated with large numbers of old vehicles or old technology. The Air Force is a small fleet of Soviet helicopters and aging fighter jets whose effectiveness is questionable and would likely be wiped out quickly in the event of a major new Russian incursion," experts say. So the limited things that Ukraine does have access to aren't even in the best condition and are severely outdated. Also, most of it was the Russians to begin with. Basically, Ukraine is in a lot of trouble. Their defense also hangs heavily on how Russia chooses to attack them in the first place. The Center for Strategic and International Studies released a great article detailing the 3 possible invasion routes. The 3 routes, as they say, are the northern route, the central route, and the southern route. The northern route, as they write, is where Russia could advance toward Kiev along 2 routes. The first would be 150 miles by road through Novy Yurkovichy, Chernihiv, and into Kiev. The second would be a 200-mile thrust through Topachok, Konotop, Nisiev, and into Kiev. If Minsk were to acquiesce to the use of its road and rail networks, the Russian army could outflank Ukrainian defenses around Kiev and approach them from the rear via a 150-mile axis of advance from Mazhyr, Belarus, to Korenstan, Ukraine, and finally to Kiev. The central route is where Russia could also advance due west along 3 routes. The first might include a 200-mile axis that moves through Belograde, Kharkov, Poltava, and finally to Kremenchuk. The second might include a 140-mile axis thrust through Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and possibly another thrust from Donetsk to Dnipro. The third might involve Russian forces advancing along the coastline toward Mariupol, Berdyansk, and the Perekop Isthmus, connecting Crimea to Ukraine. And the southern route is where Russia could also advance across the Perekop Isthmus to take Kherson and the source of the fresh water for Crimea, and simultaneously toward the vicinity of Melitopol to link up with Russian forces advancing along the coast of the Sea of Azov. If Russia was to attempt option 5, this would be the main attack coupled with the assault along the coastline toward Mariupol and Berdyansk. But it would be the hardest to sustain logistically due to the lack of railway running along the Sea of Azov coast and the main direction of advance. So that's kind of the breakdown of some potential Russian invasion strategies, but considering Ukraine has no idea which one Russia will do, I don't know how much this is going to help them. Ukraine is really not in a good spot here, and their best chance for success is to be as close with NATO as they possibly can be. Without their support, they will assuredly be taken over by the Russians in a matter of time. They may be able to hold out for a few weeks, maybe even a month or so, but eventually the overwhelming numbers and superior strategy will take hold and they will lose. But please let me know in the comments down below what you think about all of this. Do you think that Ukraine actually does have a shot at defending themselves, or are they gonna need some help? Also, please hit the like and subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching. I've been your host, Nicholas Playlog, and I'll catch you next time.
Which country would win World War III? To be truthful, this is a bit of a difficult question to answer because a lot of it would depend on where the war begins, what it's over, and of course, I am not a fortune teller, so it's impossible to say for sure, but we can always look at the things we do know and draw whatever conclusions we wish. So let's do that. Firstly, where in our 2022 world would a world war likely break out, should it unfortunately come to that? I think the most obvious answer right now would be Russia or Ukraine. Of course, there has been conflict there for quite some time, and each day the tensions rise with more countries listening in and beginning to get involved, although carefully and conservatively. The real root of this conflict that is ongoing truly does stem all the way back to the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Ukraine, which is a former Soviet republic, went on to have the third largest atomic arsenal in the world after the breakup of the Soviet Union. This led to both the United States and Russia working to denuclearize the country, and after coming to a series of agreements, Ukraine gave their nuclear warheads to Russia in exchange for security that would prevent them from a Russian attack. Then, flash forward to 2014, Russia invades Ukraine. The conflict has only risen, and it's become worse over time, however, and it really is about the future of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin sees Ukraine as a place or a way that Russia can show its influence in Europe and really to the rest of the world, and he is seemingly willing to launch another invasion on the country at any time. But this time, unlike what happened in 2014, more people and more countries, including Ukraine itself, are prepared. In 2014, the US was slow to react to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is because at the time, President Barack Obama was a little hesitant to react because he didn't want to escalate tensions with Russia. This led to the delay in the mobilization of diplomatic response in Europe, and Ukrainians were left without offensive weapons. That is not the case this time. In terms of this conflict at this point in time, both Russia and the US have drawn their lines in the sand. Russia presented the US with a list of demands that they had, and the US chose to reject some of those. US President Joe Biden is reportedly trying to renegotiate some of these terms and include some things that certainly would be of interest to Russia, such as the stationing of ground-launched missile systems in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, and this is all in an attempt to keep an all-out war from happening. One of the many on the list of demands was a ban on Ukraine from joining the NATO, something that both the US and the NATO itself rejected. Ukraine has a right to choose its own geopolitical alignments. Basically, this just scratches the surface on what is going on with that conflict right now, but experts are warning that the possibility of invasion is high, and invasion might mean the beginning of something that none of us want to see. Russia continues to deny that there is a planned attack, but there are currently about 130,000 troops fully equipped located right at Ukraine's border. So, if this is the beginning of the war, if this is how World War III begins, what will happen from there? Right now, there are talks of the growing positive relationship between China and Russia. This puts an interesting twist on things because right now, the three biggest military powers in the world are Russia, China, and the United States. China is agreeing with Russia, and it's also opposed to the expansion of the NATO, with Putin claiming that Western powers are using the NATO defense alliance to undermine Russia. Now, this is interesting because it also feeds into the current conflict that is going on in Taiwan. China's leader has been very vocal about how he believes that his path to national rejuvenation cannot be complete and successful until Taiwan unifies with the mainland, whether they want to or not, but Taiwan still insists that they are independent. So it's sort of similar to how Russia wants Ukraine, how Putin suggests that the Russian people and the Ukrainian people are all one, despite those in Ukraine not at all feeling the same. These two situations mirror each other on how the two leaders are willing to invade and even go to war to take over these unwilling territories, but the difference between them is that the People's Liberation Army really is going so strong and confident in their beliefs that, given their economic and military strength, should anyone else, including the US, choose to intervene, they doubt it would end up swaying them from their goal in the end. This would prove to be even more troublesome for the US, since if Taiwan were to fall into the hands of the Chinese government, the US would have a harder time defending its critical allies, Japan and the Philippines. This is all important because these similarities in situations might continue to draw Russia and China together if their bonding over wanting to dominate Western powers isn't enough. If the two were to sort of team up, for lack of a better way to put it, the US and the NATO in general might have a much harder time fighting back. Right now, the US is in a bit of a precarious place. Sending troops and resources to Taiwan takes them away from Ukraine, and vice versa. There's enough to go around, but it definitely spreads things thin, which is a lot less than ideal. This means that in order to protect both places, Europe needs to build up their own defense, and truthfully, since 2014, Ukraine has been doing just that. I mean, the NATO allies spend a lot more on their militaries than Russia does, and the US can bolster them with support and weapons, and they can still be committed to helping and defending, but in a more constrained capacity that would allow them to keep their focus elsewhere as well. I'm not saying that this is the best option, I'm just putting forward hypothetical scenarios. The worry is that China will use the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a window of US distraction in order to act and invade Taiwan. But the same could be said in the opposite scenario, so it's tough to find the right balance. Here's the thing. While those at the moment are the places and reasons where and why a world war could break out, we have to think of the logistics of it following that. If Russia and China were to team up together, that would be bad for the United States, but that does not mean that the two could just waltz into the United States, invade, and take claim. That is far from happening. The United States would be virtually impossible to invade. At the start of the war, not only would US forces come up to Canada, but they would also extend down south as well into Mexico. No chance of invading coastal US cities because of both submarine and air power. If invading from the north or the south, there would be miles of land and hundreds of people to get through first, which would end up depleting most of your resources before even getting to the US border. On the other hand, an invasion of Russia would be disastrous. Russia is huge. It's the same deal if someone tried to invade the US by coming through Canada. There is so much ground to cover. Most of your resources are going to be wasted just crossing the international distance and then the domestic distances just for an attack. So if invasion isn't really an option, that leaves one big scary option, and that is long distance weaponry. Of course, I'm talking about missiles and the like, and unfortunately with that comes the talk of nuclear weaponry. If we were simply talking about numbers like spending budget, numbers in fleets, that sort of thing, we would only be talking about China and the US. In terms of spending and budget, the US defense budget sits at an approximate $705 billion in 2021, while China's defense spending in 2021 was a number of around $209 billion once converted into US dollars. So of course the US budget is way larger, but China does not have the high costs of paying an all-volunteer force, and China's military activities are largely focused on East Asia, while the US has a footprint footprint all over the world. This means that while the gap in spending seems to be huge, it's not quite as large as it may appear on the surface. If we look into resources and warships, China is leading the US in terms of combat vessels. I mean, there are shipyards absolutely pumping out new warships on a weekly basis, but the turn of this is that while they have more, they are of lesser quality. US ships are ton for ton larger, they are better offensively and defensively, and they are manned by more experienced crews. This is all to say that both have their own advantages and disadvantages, and it's not exactly clear which one is just all out stronger and better or who would win over the other. While the idea of Russia and China is definitely a terrifying one for us in the Western world, it's important to note the allies of the US who would be extremely helpful in the war. The US has a larger network of allies than China does. In Asia, this means Japan, the third largest economy in the world. It means Australia, who brings very capable naval forces. This means South Korea, Singapore, and many others, but one of the curveballs is likely to be India. For years, India hasn't been on the list of top and most powerful militaries, but that is very quickly changing. Very soon, India is definitely on track to become a military superpower. In fact, India is number 4 when it comes to the strongest militaries in the world, and they are in the midst of a total overhaul, which is doing a lot to strengthen their forces. There's plans being made to integrate the Navy and the Air Force, and doing so would make these unified armed forces easier for the US, the UK, and Australia to team up with as well. While China has the largest standing army in the world at 2.1 million troops, an allyship with India would give the US a much needed upper hand, considering they are second with 1.2 million ground troops and another 960,000 reserve officers. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that it's tough to say who would win World War III should it ever come to that. I mean, truthfully, no one really wins a war. Everyone is depleted by the end. Resources are scarce, economies take a hit, and there is a drastic loss of life which should always be avoided at all costs. It's also important to note that with the likelihood of a mass amount of nuclear weapons being used in a third world war, it's possible that no one will win because there might not be anyone left. I think that should nuclear power not entirely destroy our world, the US is likely to come out on top. Since I live in the Western world, there is possibly bias in that answer, but I truly do believe that the allyships and relationships with other countries would give us the upper hand when it comes to a world war. Russia is powerful and scary, but one country's allyship does not a world war win. Alright guys, that has been our LBQ for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. Stay curious, my friends, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!